In the year 2200, humanity became vaguely aware that their caretakers were up to something. It began far from the landing pages, presented amid other goings-on across the terrestrial, as it was called. A modest bullet point list mentioned, in summary, an experiment centuries in the making. The wording ensured nothing was thought of it, for such grasps at profundity were the bread and bean curds of the Sustainability Initiative. They would describe their own work with such embarrassing passion that it was widely agreed they must in fact be doing nothing at all. And who could blame them, for to serve the planet as they did was the chore to end all chores, a turn of phrase that applies here literally. This time though, the matter began popping up everywhere. Votes on the nature of celebrations, invitations to experience-related broadcasts, insidious paper notes left on virtual desktops which would reel off the entire history of the project if you looked at them for too long. What schoolchild didn't already know about the gate? And what adult didn't already know that it was not a gate, but a twin pair of black claws that floated silently in the outer solar system? It was virtually nothing, for almost anything virtual was of greater import at that time. It made for a nice earring design, and that was about the most people cared for it. Clearly it had not always been that way. Humanity of the 20th century had obsessed over this gate at great expense. They gave it a suitably luxurious name, the Black Crown. They would wait for years with bated breath for their clumsy probes to scratch a secret from the cosmic dust. But as the wait grew longer and longer, life went on, and then away. The Black Crown wasn't going anywhere, or doing anything, and who could care any less about something like that? Everyone presumed that there must be an extremely interesting explanation, but that could be said of so many other things, and other things had explanations that were forthcoming by the graces of their writers. By the time humanity were done sorting themselves out across the 22nd century, the Black Crown was just another asteroid. It was only of interest to the gravitational mass of bureaucracy forming out of the nation-states, a mass that coalesced into the Sustainability Initiative. This tightening wad of technocrats was to deal with the physical world, with the terrestrial, in humanity's stead. They ruled the terrestrial with absolute power, but had absolutely no power over most goings-on in the virtual, where lives were lived more fully than ever before. They became another barrier between matters like the Black Crown and the average person, to whom terrestrial matters were not only occurring outside of their day-to-day realm, but on the other side of a great impenetrable guardian, the Initiative. Much as one knows little of the sewers beneath their feet, people came to know little of the domestic tribulations on the other side of their virtual interface, and those that did were in most cases working for the Initiative. In the 2170s, the Initiative came into possession of a rather large space station, from which further probing of the Crown could be brought into budget. That this was the case is more remarkable than it sounds, for the Initiative was beholden to its administrative mission. It was, in older terms, like learning the Postal Service had seized an oil rig and were planning to map the sea floor. These space projects were by and large conducted by a handful of high-ranking peers only, sometimes without proper authority from the people. Such was required, for their government was a form of direct democracy, albeit with a large catch. The voters were so removed from the matters being voted on that popular control was rarely exerted. It was thanks to this glaring yet unassailable flaw that the Sustainability Initiative steered humanity towards the stars, bit by bit. In their scant breaks from keeping humanity safely tucked in, they reached out across the solar system and finally found what had been under the very fingers of the earlier manned missions. When the thick white gloves of the old pioneers had brushed across the gate's surface, they felt and saw only iron. Boring old iron, of all things. What they had missed were the works of molecular art inscribed across the entire hull. The Initiative's microscopes revealed it all, and for weeks, months, humanity was alive with hope and cheer. It was a message from a source contested without end. Suddenly, gods were real, but maybe only one of them, or perhaps it was one they hadn't thought of yet. The years wore on, and with not a mote of progress decoding the stuff, humanity wore out. The overreach of the SI became less forgivable to the enthusiastic followers of terrestrial matters, and they were able to silence any Black Crown projects for many years. But by the 2190s, these power brokers had passed on or drifted to business in other worlds. Sensing opportunity, a young peer proposed an all-in mission to decode the Crown's secrets with civilian computational power. While almost all humanity would encounter the bumps this CPU siphoning entailed, not many learned of this before the project passed the General Assembly. This was the defining legislation of the 22nd century, entirely because of what it would mean for the 23rd. It was the neat year 2200 when those annoying pop-ups informed the people of Earth that the great cosmic experiment was beginning. The atomic scroll on the crown had not been art, but instruction. Instruction on exotic science that could turn an ordinary ship into a galaxy trotter. To summarize the theory, while all space had been made equal, someone had altered that since. There was a network of paths, so to speak, between certain stars. They were enthusiastically called hyperlanes by initiative marketing. Earth lay at the junction of 3 such curiosities. These paths, invisible from the outside and inaccessible without the secrets the Black Crown bore, were shortcuts. If one could look down a hyperlane, it would be like peering at a distant star through a telescope. Then, if you clambered into the telescope, you would fall out the other side and see that star just as large with your naked eyes, for you really were there now. This was a concept readily familiar to Earthlings, for whom teleportation and warping of space was a part of everyday virtual life. This familiarity contributed to the disinterest in the news that the first ever human expedition through a hyperlane had just blasted off from the SI station close to the Sun. Yushin Ishikawa, the captain, was the very image of a so-called floater, that being one who had lived their life in space. His skin was not quite pale, but perhaps grey, and his hair was flat and monochrome. He spoke as one might write, wrote as one might dance, and danced not at all. He was precisely the outcast the Sustainability Initiative was always sure to reel in. That he was the face of this mission seemed a joke to the Earthlings, but on the other hand, he was no great loss were he to disappear into that strange galactic plug hole. Yushin and his ship, the Aldrin, reached the outer solar system in a few weeks, then disappeared with a sudden flash of light. Minutes later, he appeared on screens across Earth, sporting an ugly grin. Behind him was the writhing blue flame of Sirius A, more than 8 light-years from Sol. These images, travelling the same hyperlane he had, were the beginning of a very great change for humanity. Still not an especially interesting one to most, but the consequences were yet to reveal themselves. Sirius was populated with various stellar bodies, much as the Sol system was. The Aldrin logged asteroids, planets, planetoids, and of course performed a data-gathering flyby of the cool binary stars revolving at the center. Not since the invention of space telescopes had such an overwhelming deluge of information been feasted upon by the scientific community. It was a feast held under the table, so to speak, for the Sustainability Initiative had limited resources for their business in space, and most were doing their actual job. That being to begin the transfer of material from the outer planets and moons back to Earth. To preserve humankind was the SI's only purpose, and what humankind did with the lives the SI granted them was no one's business. Looking beyond the human pale at the mathematics of the hyperlanes or the dark planets of a far-off binary pair was of immense interest to the Council of Peers, but of no clear value whatsoever to the people. And by now, the people were starting to learn that resources were being wasted on expensive space missions and not on their own well-being. So it was that amid the constant ferrying of ores from Callisto or charged gases from Uranus, only one other craft was spared to gaze out of those magical telescopes and slip away. Some 8 months after Captain Yushin departed, the SIS Zheng He under Captain Antonio Torres flashed into one of the other 2 hyperlanes away from Sol. It was pointed squarely at humanity's old muse, the Alpha Centauri system. Torres had been pushed onto the mission at the insistence of her domestic syndicate. They had found no other way to oust the soft-spoken Spartan from her seat on their committee. Strangely, the Council of Peers forced the syndicate to hold elections just days later, with all the incumbent officers barred from standing. Such was the attitude of First Peer Meiji towards the merest hint of ulterior motives, and indeed such was the depth of power the SI held over the ground-level administration of Earth. Torres left Sol to great attempts at fanfare, lauded as a citizen scientist of Earth, albeit one who refused to appear on camera. Yushin, on the other hand, was one the cameras refused to point at. With almost no attendance to his command votes at all, he was literally left to his own devices. He had sent probes out through the lanes discovered out of Sirius, and had followed one of them himself when a rare neutron star was found. It was called Mufrid, and there he established himself to gather enough research data to last a lifetime. Over the course of the following months, Earth's attention was earned. First, in November, the Black Crown event. It was a harmless magic trick in which a shudder of space-time had spat a shattered planetoid out of the nothing between the Crown's claws. The drifting debris was no threat, but it was a message. The Black Crown was awake, and its power was real. What had noticed the SI accessing the hyperlanes, and what did this response mean? For the first time in living memory, something of genuine interest was happening out in the terrestrial, and the novelty of this allowed the news greater discussion than even later, far more important developments. The forgotten mystery out in the real world was alive again. The people gave out the mandate for research to be done, but whatever deific power was behind this, it was beyond any detector or expedition. And so, humanity simply had to go back to their business, now aware that an ancient power was almost certainly working some machinations beyond the bounds of the terrestrial. It was a stunning thing to know, but also numbing. It was like dangers witnessed in the world of a movie or game, with the heroic sustainability initiative already in place to deal with it. The distinction between apathy towards some vampire threat in old Victorian England and this rock-spitting enigma out on the terrestrial faded away with the year's end. Then came February 18th, 2201, B-Day as it would later be termed, for if Earth was Planet A, what Torres had found on Alpha Centauri 3 made that green-blue marble Planet B. The blue part, water, the green part, alien life. This was no dead bacteria on an asteroid. This was a fully functioning alien ecosystem, evolved on a world extremely similar to Earth. Nothing was exactly waving back, but it was the inevitable proof that many had been waiting for, that life was a fact of the universe. The planet next door was teeming with critters, and it was first come first served insofar as rights to merchandise their likenesses. Thus, between Yushin and Torres, it was the latter's discoveries that were going to make the headlines. It had been a long time since a single headline had made it to the ears and eyes of all humanity. Planet B was a wake-up call, a call that signalled the revived relevance of the terrestrial, which, despite resistance, came to refer to all that was not virtual. That something was going on with the Black Crown and the hyperlanes was nice and all, but Planet B brought about something that humans could do themselves. The planet had breathable oxygen and fluffy quadrupeds. Those who couldn't find their way on Earth had somewhere else to go. Votes for a base on Planet B got closer and closer to passing, and a fascination with this complex new stranger-than-fiction story created a major subculture of Planet B mania. A year after B-Day, which is when this term was coined for it, Yushin got his revenge. He had landed on Murfid 1, one of the neutron star's thoroughly baked satellites. He was chasing a blot on the planet's heat map, no bigger than a human, yet detectable from orbit on the Aldrin. He sent back pictures of what he found. a yellowish slab of rock streaked with neatly carved text. One could be sure it was text, for the reverse side linked the symbols used to shapes, numbers, and more perplexing pictograms. It was the basis for translation, surely left deliberately. It would take an extreme feat of chance for this discovery to not be a smoking gun on the matter of intelligent alien life at large in the galaxy. Such a notion was almost required for the Black Crown and the Hyperlanes to fit anywhere into humanity's understanding of science. And this was it. It was such a perfect find, from such a strange and hopeless location, that Yushin was slammed as the greatest fraudster in all academia. It should be noted that no one in said academia was willing to go so far, but they must have had their doubts, especially given the shadow cast by Torres. The distant hermit of a neutron star may well have lost his mind, some surmised. Yushin had to bring his prize to market himself. He and his crew began translating the tablet. He was, for a time, suspended from the SI for this, but his rank was reinstated following a jarring happening in Seoul, the second Black Crown event. Power surged in the bent arms of the twin machines, and after a brief ripple, something appeared. It was called a space amoeba, a name hiding its scale. Its image was that of a quadruple-tailed tadpole, limey in colour and bordered by brilliant luminescent frills. Cute enough to merchandise, one supposes, but Earth was not in the mood. Or at least, of the 16% voting on the matter, 60 were of the opinion that the creature be forcefully expelled. The Council of Peers could not disagree, for they had nothing they could say of the creature that met any sort of rigorous standard of proof. All that could be said was that its frills afforded its mountain-sized form some mobility even in the near vacuum, and it was swimming to lower and lower orbits of Sol. Obliging the fears raised on Earth, the SI sent its grand battle fleet into action. This fleet, totaling 3 vessels and 0 crew, was borrowed from the Sol station. There they had the duty of destroying debris and rocks approaching the hull, and as such were equipped with ice-melting lasers and pummeling mass drivers. Everyone had their own image of conflict between humans and the unknown aliens surely lurking in the cosmos, and this battle between a drifting, shiny sponge and 3 clueless safety measures was not it. That the amoeba spat fluids out at the drones was interesting, but had no bearing on the encounter's result. The creature was scorched and perforated without relent until it ceased to alter its course. Over the next few days, its luminescence faded, and the great First Contact War was over. The SI managed to allocate itself an additional research vessel to go dock with the great carcass and keep it from falling into Sol. One Shu Suma was made captain amid strong competition. To become the first xenobiologist was an honor the SI would make sure stood the test of time, after all. The people voted Captain Shu in very much on the basis that she made no fuss about this honor, while the rest of the candidates wasted valuable seconds expressing their humility in the face of it. Her earliest reports claimed that the amoeba was still alive, but this was revised later to merely be a mistaken impression of its remarkable regenerative properties. This creature registered as being incredibly young, with no cell aged beyond a year. Yet new cells were being spat from the old without end. The crippling radiation of space was overcome by a continuous process of rebirth. Shu Sumar and her crew on the SIS Scout were tasked with finding out how the regenerative process avoided mutation or cancerous growth. Truly, this strange visitor was another gift from the Black Crown in this regard, but its origin, its intention, and its connection to the mysteries of the era, these matters stirred up fear like nothing else outer space had to offer. Captain Yushin was reinstated and received copious praise for his distant, nearly forgotten scholarship. He reminded the well-wishers that his work could have nothing to do with the Black Crown. He was ignored and wished well further. Towards the end of that year, 2202, a gathering of cargo craft took place in Earth's orbit. They were about to embark on the Sustainability Initiative's most ambitious project, to secure Planet B. Thanks to their prior work, humanity did not require an additional planet, but some noisy wards were clamoring for it all the same. The SI's stated goal was to preserve humanity's economy forever, which in a pure sense meant that they couldn't rely on anything that might not last forever. But forever was a long time, and even the stars would betray their residents eventually. This inconsistency was the gap in their armor, through which flowed calls for Alpha Centauri and its verdant gardens to be mixed into the great throat of Earth's industry. It would certainly make things easier, so with a gust of popular support in their sails, the Council of Peers cut up an old space station in low Earth orbit and shipped it down the hyperlane to Captain Torres over the coming year. Torres spent the first half of that year conducting an economical survey of the system. Wherever she and the SIS Zhenghe went, a growing fleet of utility craft flocked at their backs, left to probe mineral-rich asteroids and the strange ices of frozen moons. She was very clear in her reports. These resources were expendable and were hence useless. But like her old comrades in her home syndicate, the Earthlings were not convinced. On Earth, the so-called Little Exodus was already beginning. The SI called it colonization fever and treated it very much as a disease. Colonizing an alien planet was just about the last thing a biological creature should want to do, it was reasoned, yet the evidence said otherwise. The idea of creating an additional Earth was the most popular notion ever pinned to the SI, and as such it was hard to ignore. It was orders of magnitude easier to colonize Earth orbit than another solar system, but it lacked the punch to get any excitement down through the interference between reality and the Earthlings. Hoping things would turn out differently, the SI had, years prior, built great cylindrical habitats above Earth, prototypes for some very livable abodes in the comfortable light of Sol. These were, like that old space station, broken up and folded away for transit. A few thousand SI members were recruited for the burgeoning colonization project, while the Earthlings gave their utmost approval and awaited the good news. Some even asked to go themselves, but that really was a breach of the SI's responsibilities. While work on a huge colony craft trickled along reluctantly, demand for maps of the hyperlanes became the next terrestrial intrigue. Several had been detected shooting off from Alpha Centauri, and down one of them Torres was sent. From Earth too, Shu Sima was ripped from her lodgings astride the unrotting Amoeba to pilot the Scout through the final lane away from Sol. With more people than ever before tuning in to the terrestrial, the SI seemed to bend as much as it could bear to make them feel welcome, and with the welcome extended, this new audience bid that adventure and discovery be had, so long as it was not too time-consuming to follow. Such was the casual optimism of 2203. There was so much out there, more than a human could appreciate, but it seems the humans of the day at least wished to try, or order someone else to try. And that, ultimately, was what the Sustainability Initiative was for. Of their 30 million staff, about 7,000 had now been spared for this curious project to expand the reach of the terrestrial, including 3 elected peers. Their journey beyond the bounds of humanity's guardian bureaucracy was justified in the dry words of First Peer Meiji. To preserve humanity forever, we must understand the arena in which we are to be preserved. That overcoming its trials will be difficult is not a concern, for to allow it to overcome us would be the lesser result. Her use of the term arena was questioned at first, but deemed prophetic later. Her words foreshadowed the sobering message to humanity that was to arrive that September, and the testing discoveries burning in its wake.